Okay, so now we're going to talk about Princess Elizabeth and Anton Wilhelm Amo. So, the basic idea behind the criticism of both of these philosophers, and hence why they're, positioned on the syllabus together or immediately after we read Descartes, is because they offer criticisms of Descartes' substance dualism. And in particular, they offer a criticism of this sort of third perspective where we are supposed to be able to embody a perspective where we view people under the aspects of both kinds of substances. We understand them as a mind and as a body. And so the basic impetus behind these questions is, how is that possible? How is it possible for a mind and a body to interact given Descartes' conception of these two kinds of substances? And this is something that, as you read the correspondence with Princess Elizabeth, that Princess Elizabeth brings up rather early. She says basically, how can we think about voluntary actions, so actions in which the mind causes the body to move in a certain way, if the mind is itself something which does not occupy a location space? And so her argument is pretty simple. It's something like, things can only be caused by other things that exist in space. That's how causal interaction between bodies happen. And it doesn't seem like there's a very plausible candidate or explanation for how something which is not material, not extended in space, can cause something that is extended in space to move. That just seems rather puzzling. And moreover, this is not just like an abstract philosophical puzzle. For Princess Elizabeth, it really has to do with the passions and the emotions. And while the correspondence that's in our anthology is somewhat limited, if you read the rest of the correspondence with Princess Elizabeth, a lot of the time Descartes is giving her advice for how to deal with depression. And Descartes' basic point is usually to say something like, you are such a virtuous person, Princess Elizabeth, that you are so troubled by all the things happening to your royal family, and this has made you melancholic. And so they, sort of try to read or talk about Stoic philosophies together. They talk about reading Seneca. And the basic idea is and this is the basic idea of Stoicism, is just that you can sort of adjust your own mental attitude towards things so that when things go badly in the world, you're not so horribly affected. And that seems to have some basic, it jives well with, it accompanies Descartes' picture rather well, because, the most fundamental part of yourself is the mind, which has the ability to abstract from everything that's going on in the world. Now, the way that Princess Elizabeth often responds to this is to say that, she's not as virtuous as Descartes thinks. I think that this is pretty typical where, women are excluded from academic spaces for centuries. I mean, Princess Elizabeth for quite a long time was not really read as a philosopher. That's a relatively recent phenomena that we've begun to read her in this way. But it's pretty obvious that she's philosophically astute. Jae-Gwon Kim, he is a contemporary philosopher of mind. He cites her as developing the first materialist argument against substance dualism. So it's a materialist argument because she is trying to point out the paradox in something minded, so not extended, not bodily, causing something that is material or extended and bodily, and arguing that that is incoherent, that Descartes has not yet really given a good account of that in the Meditations. And in what you have read or will read, Descartes actually is pretty much willing to concede the point and say, yeah, in the Meditations, I don't really develop this perspective very much. I just sort of like give you the rudimentary outlines of what an adequate philosophy of mind would entail. And so he ends up writing the Principles of Philosophy some 4 years later, dedicates it to Princess Elizabeth. He then also writes the Passions of the Soul, which I believe is 1649. And this also was written really in response to the concerns that Princess Elizabeth brings before him. And, you know, you really have to in some ways give it up for Descartes in that he decided not to be a rampant misogynist, which is usually what happens when you read philosophers from hundreds of years ago, oftentimes because, you know, they are able to occupy their position because of their insistence on their status as aristocrats, or, you know, and in this case as aristocratic men, landowning oftentimes men or people that are supported by nobility in some respect. And there's no doubt that part of the reason why Descartes has such an esteem for Princess Elizabeth is the fact that she's royalty. But she's not really royalty that's in any position to help Descartes. And moreover, he never really, I think, placates her. I think that he treats her rather seriously as a philosopher, even more seriously than she is at times willing to treat herself. And the development of Descartes' philosophical oeuvre after the Meditations is really, really determined by this correspondence with Princess Elizabeth. So that's really interesting. So you don't have the opportunity to read the Passions of the Soul much for this course, mostly just because we have so much material that we have to get through. But in that work, Descartes tries to sort of answer this question that comes from Princess Elizabeth, which is, how do the mind and the body interact? And Descartes' answer is in some ways philosophically dissatisfying, but kind of scientifically interesting. It's certainly not correct, but it is interesting the extent to which Descartes' analysis really sort of models a lot of what we think now from a scientific perspective. And so the basic idea for Descartes in the Passions of the Soul is to try to explain how the mind can cause voluntary actions in the body. And the answer that he gives in that work is that the mind is located in the pineal gland in the brain. So it's like this specific portion of the brain. He thinks that it is this portion of the brain rather than any other portion of the brain because it's one of the only aspects of our body that's not mirrored, right? We have two eyes, we have two hands, left and right, right? Many of the organs that we have are in some ways mirrored left and right for the purposes of locomotion and the like. The pineal gland is not doubled, and Descartes thought that this was a good place for the mind to be because of the fact that the mind or the soul is not something divisible. With bodies that occupy a certain amount of space, you can always divide that space further and further. You can get smaller and smaller measurements of bodies, and for Descartes this can happen infinitely. Whereas with the mind is not divisible. It's not like you could like split me in half and then there would be like two half Penelopes or something like that. It just doesn't really work that way. The mind is indivisible, just as the soul is indivisible. And part of the reason why you would want to think that is because you want to think that while the body might decay, might be broken down by interactions with other bodies, that the soul is something that outlives that and outlives the body. And you know, here you get sort of like the traditional Christian picture of the soul. So Descartes thought that the mind was in the pineal gland and that the mind would release what he called animal spirits through the blood, and that is what causes, muscles to move, and so on, is the cause of voluntary action. Now, not all action for Descartes is voluntary. He's willing to point out ways in which our body, as just one body among others, has certain interactions that the mind doesn't play any role in. So, like, when someone, I don't know what it's called exactly, but when the doctor hits your leg or whatever, and this produces an involuntary reaction, that's the sort of thing that Descartes is perfectly able to account for. It's like, yeah, that's just how your body moves on its own. When it's one body interacting in space, like what happens is you hit a muscle, that causes that muscle to tense up, or whatever else, and you can give sort of materialist explanation like that. So that's Descartes' attempts to answer how the mind can cause actions in the body. And part of the reason why scientifically it's satisfying is because he's pretty close to talking about a nervous system, right? He's pretty close to talking about how your brain sends electrical signals to various aspects of your body, and that's pretty close, as much as we're willing to approximate 17th century science to contemporary science. That's pretty close to our image about how the brain directs various portions of the body now. However, it is still not very satisfying. The reason why it's still not very satisfying is because it's one thing to try to make the connection between the mind and the body more coherent by talking about various aspects that the body can interact with itself, to talk about blood, to talk about electrical signals or animal spirits, or whatever you would like, coursing through the blood and that sending signals and so on. That's pretty good as far as an explanation for how bodies interact with bodies, and this is in some ways a purely materialist explanation. But what Descartes really hasn't clarified at all, by virtue of this explanation, is how the mind is located in the pineal gland, and how the mind, by virtue of certain things that you think, certain representations that you have, can produce certain interactions within the body. So how does the mind decide to send certain pineal glands to your legs to make you start to run whenever you see something scary, and so on. It's not obvious that Descartes' explanation really gets you any further for answering that philosophical question. So one thing that really we're going to be talking about for the rest of class is how is an interaction between a mind and a body possible? And if that interaction is not possible, how do they relate? Because it seems like they must relate in some way, right? And this is another sort of inquiry that's developed by Amo sometime later. Anton Wilhelm Amo, he was actually an African philosopher. He was originally born in Ghana. He was stolen by the Dutch as a child. They gave him to a royal family as a slave, and that royal family was willing to give him an education. I don't think that, if you're a slave, you can really ever say that they treated him well or anything like that, treated him with any sort of respect. But in any case, he was able to get an education and become one of the, I believe that the first African philosopher to gain a doctorate in Europe. And he was really interested in the same sort of mind-body question that was investigated by Princess Elizabeth and Descartes. And the specific way that Amo tackled this problem is from sensation. So sensation is clearly one aspect or dimension in which the mind and the body interact. So, whenever I rub my hands against the desk and I feel the texture of the desk against my hands, right? On the one hand, this is a bodily interaction. My hand is interacting with the desk. But on the other hand, it is also a mind-body interaction, because I not only interact with the desk as a body, but I also take account of the sensation with my mind. And so Amo develops another broadly materialist argument against Cartesian interactionism from sensation. And so Amo's point is just, Descartes wants to say that sensation is something that happens paradigmatically, or maybe only in terms of the mind. That the mind is what senses things, and that the body does not sense things. And this makes sense because it seems like sensation is something that we use in our reasoning processes. It's not something that is independent of those processes. And so that's why Descartes would place sensation as, firmly a sort of minded activity. But Amo points out various ways in which this sort of leads to paradox or contradiction. One way is that part of the way that we sense things is through our body, right? And what we end up sensing is something that we can change through bodily interaction. So, as you get, you can touch, say, larger salt crystals, or something like that, rub them against your skin, and this will produce a certain kind of sensation. If you break down those salt crystals so that they're smaller and smaller, there will be different, more acute, fine sensations. And the idea is basically that what's happening is a bodily interaction. There's an interaction between the specific body of the salt crystals and my hand, and that is something that is modifiable by dividing the bodies further and further. And that this is not the sort of thing that you can account for purely in terms of the mind. So I think really what is most fundamental for us in terms of Amo is thinking about the extent to which our reasoning practices depend on the body. Ways in which the body plays an important role in our reasoning processes. And the most obvious way that that's true is in perception and sensation. That these are the dimensions of our existence where clearly anthropological features about us as human beings are relevant, and that a sort of purely disembodied, kind of sailor on a ship sort of analogy like Descartes uses in the Sixth Meditation is not so helpful. And so really what you see, and it's very interesting because from a feminist as well as anti-racist perspective, a lot of the way that these contemporary feminist and anti-racist perspectives position themselves is as a critique of Western binary thinking. And the person that they have in mind the most, typically, is Descartes. Descartes' distinction between the mind and the body, the rational dimension of our existence and the irrational dimension of our existence. And this is often used in sexist and racist ways during this period to say that men are more akin to this rational element, and women are more akin to animalistic or purely bodily dimension of their existence. They're tied to their bodies in ways that men are somehow not. And similarly, obviously there are all these sort of racist, pro-colonialist arguments that sort of make something to the effect of European minds are somehow more minded than other minds, and that other races of people are more bodily. And so it's interesting to see already in the 17th and 18th centuries, you can kind of see from women and from black philosophers a criticism of this way of thinking, ways that it clearly is not able to account for dimensions of our emotions, the passions, depression, that you can see Princess Elizabeth to bring up and discuss and push Descartes to develop his account. And it's also, can't really account for the ways that we're affected by the world, the ways that the world comes and affects our body in various ways. And so this is 2 criticisms of Descartes' interactionism from Princess Elizabeth and Anton Wilhelm Amo. I hope that you enjoy the readings for this week, and I'll see you next week.